Welcome to Geek Out Weekly, the podcast where we geek out not so strongly on a roughly 7-day basis. I'm your host, Adil, and as almost always, I'm joined this week by Ben.
Hello.
And this week we are talking Jupiter's Legacy, a Netflix superhero drama of some proportions.
I mean, it's a good way to sort of intro it. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I think that was a compliment. I can't tell.
No, it definitely was. Definitely was. It's a bit of an odd show, right? I'm going to jump straight into initial impressions, right? It's a bit of an odd show. I don't know. There's lots to kind of unpack with it because it feels like, I mean, it's a superhero show, but it's more like a drama than an action show. And whilst there are actiony bits in it, and there are powers and lots of kind of effects going on and things, this very much more feels like a drama set around this superpowered family and not hugely into the world that they kind of inhabit. It is very much to do with them. They are the main focus for this. It's a show that and a franchise that I'm very unfamiliar with. I only know that it was a comic written by Mark Millar, and that's kind of it. That's all I know going into this show. And I think I jumped in having enjoyed Mark Millar's previous kind of comic to film adaptations like Kick-Ass and stuff. So I kind of went into this with high hopes, I suppose. How about yourself?
I've read some things by Mark Millar. I haven't read this. I think you're right. I've got a lot of thoughts on this. But you're right. Ultimately, it's a drama, and it's the world at large is window dressing for the struggle of the powered people, and most of the powered people are window dressing for the struggle of the core family.
Yes.
Most of the core family are window dressing for the struggle of Sheldon, aka Utopian.
Yep.
Even the other two, even his son, who's sort of a semi-focused secondary protagonist, is basically just struggling with being in his shadow. Boy, are the female characters. I'm just essentially foils for men and their struggles, or less. It's the Utopian show essentially.
Yes.
And that took a little while because it's presented as an ensemble, but not really. And so one of the things is what I like about it is it does this parallel time stream, the 1930s and the leading up to how this group of people got their superpowers.
Yep.
And then present day and the struggles of the family and people with society at large in general. I thought that was really cool.
I agree.
It made for pretty good, not just straightforward, oh, they had a struggle in the past here, so we'll mirror it. Much more textual, less textual and subtextual connections between the flashbacks and the modern time, which I appreciated. It wasn't just like, we fought this guy and now we're fighting this guy. In fact, the main big bad, whose name I already forgot, the guy who was cloned.
Black Star.
Black Star.
Black Star? Yeah.
Black Star, we never see in the past. He's on a first name basis with the superheroes. He clearly is a longtime villain, but we don't see him, and it would be very easy for them to do for the parallels to be and then they fought the guy, and now they're still fighting the guy. That's a very easy way to do the parallels across two timelines, and they rarely have, like I said, the same people or the textual struggle being the same.
Yep.
But the subtextual struggle is the same, and I think it's just really well written that way, and that's what kept me sort of enjoying the series, was that under the hood stuff. And then my biggest problem is some of it I can't tell is me reading into the show versus the show knowing what it's doing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Explain. a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm trying to not go like into another like, hey, here's my 12 minutes on Jupiter's Legacy. I just mean, so there's certain. All right, I'm just gonna do it. So
Do it.
Let's take a step back. So the idea is in the 30s, this dude, this really rich white dude's dad made a steel company, and the stock market crashes. His dad kills himself, and then he starts getting visions of that lead him to a magic island where where he gets superpowers. He gathers some of his friends and the reporter who like broke the story, and his dad being a bad guy, and some random other people. Um, and he gets them to the island, and they overcome challenges that previous people in previous eras of the world didn't, and they get superpowers. That's the 1930s plot line, and it stretches over all 8 episodes. I think the dynamics between the people we'll get into when we talk about characters, so I think that's the main arc that way. And then in the modern time, it's basically this notion of so what comes out of that is this idea that one of the reasons why they succeeded was they stayed on their same page, and they avoided killing, and that was a necessary like puzzle piece to get through the challenges of the island. You okay?
It's a helicopter very, very close to my house. It's very loud for me.
Oh,
Maybe
well,
not for you.
Yeah, I can't hear it.
Good.
So, but yeah, so the central piece of the show is this idea that superhero people need to live by the code, which is stay out of politics, don't kill people, essentially. In fact, it's described as exactly that by the Utopian, which is the patriarch of the main family, and the head of the Union is what they call themselves. The Justice League
Union.
in this, in this show is the Union. And it seems like people in the modern era are struggling. And like, so the big fight is the Black Star comes and is beating the hell out of everyone, and then the Utopian son Paragon, or Brandon, who is just lived his entire life in his dad's shadow, ends up saving his dad's life by killing Black Star. And that's the main like inciting incident of the modern arc, and like the repercussions of killing and breaking the code, and then people questioning whether the code is right, etc. That's the thing. All right. Why I had to say all that is basically because it really feels like this show, what I can't tell is like so much of the show is like, oh, it's much tougher now, things aren't black and white. Oh, but back in the day we could trust supervillains not to hunt us down and kill us. It just seems like a boomer's wet dream of the past rather than what the past actually was. And they do call out Sheldon on being kind of blind to that.
Yes.
So but the others kind of say it too, like his brother, the psychic, and his wife, the ex-reporter now turned wife and homemaker, and superhero. They all say, yeah, it was simpler times back then, and this is what I mean about the tension between. Am I reading too much into this? In like the critique of that mentality, or is it actually living in that mentality, but they think they're calling it out in one character, but also some of it seems to indicate that like actually it is about things are tough now today and they weren't before, because enough people say that. But actually the message that rung true to me in like the therapy sessions that Sheldon Utopian goes through seemed to indicate, yeah, you just don't realize it's always been bad. But it's just the rest of the cast, like other scenes, don't support that reading. But that's the reading that makes the most sense to me. Otherwise, it just becomes, like I said, this fetishization of the 50s of being the best time of America, and now things are gray and shitty. And like too much of the show seems to lean into that outside of Sheldon's struggle with trying to be the paragon of good. So it's really strange to me because I liked that specifically making that point, because I was getting icky feels from the show about, like you said, like in the greater societal context, this like fetishization of things were just easier back in the day when people of color stayed in their place, women stayed in their place, and white dudes got away with things. Right, like that's the general thing going on in society, and this very much felt like he was just blind to his heyday was good for him and maybe not for other people. But then
Absolutely.
The next episode, they have a whole bunch of people like, yeah, maybe the code sucks now. It definitely worked in the past. It says 3 characters from his same generation, and you're like, I don't think you're saying the positive thing about toxic, like nostalgia and toxic attitudes not working. I think you're saying the world is gray today, but it's always been gray, and so that's where I struggle with how much I want to laud it versus worry that I'm giving it more credit than it's due.
Sure, I think it's a little bit of both. I think it does live in that kind of unexplained kind of middle ground. Yes, they are trying to give you kind of this positive affirmation that maybe things have always been grey, but without really kind of delving into it and making the characters kind of seem blind to that it was, at least they thought it was better then. And there's lots to unpack within that kind of point as well, in people's changing viewpoints. Even the idea that we have this cast of characters in the 30s who go through and get their kind of powers. They haven't got anything to lose. They're kind of rich kids. They can kind of, they can charter a boat and kind of go off. Suddenly they've now got all of this weight on them of having the powers and having had them for so long, and then the family dynamic coming into that as well, and having all of these other people that they have to kind of not live with, but share that space with as well. And so there's change in perspective for these characters, which may be explained a little bit more in season 2. Not to sort of jump too far ahead, but we kind of see his Sheldon's brother Walter essentially be the kind of the villain in the background, right? Unleashed kind of in the last episode, but you sort of think that it's George, who is their friend, who got powers with them in the 30s, and it kind of leads you sort of down that path, but nothing in terms of their motivations, whether it was George and it is Walter. You don't get really their motivations, except for kind of some lines towards the end of Walter sort of saying, what did he say? I can't remember. He gives this sort of like little speech at the end, which sort of gives you an understanding about what he's thinking, but there's nothing backing that up really. So yeah. I think it's definitely there. What you're saying is definitely there, that they're trying to not say and fetishize the past, but use it in a way which might push their motivations a little bit. It just isn't explored enough. And I think a part of that problem and why it isn't explored enough is because half of the show is this flashback to the 30s of them getting them powers, which in my opinion was actually the more interesting part of the show.
Well,
but it took up a lot of space.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. Is like they were using the. So I think that maybe you hit the nail on the head there, where it was more interesting because the only strife was personal and like finding the magic island. But that was actually pretty easily done. Like when you think about the beats, right?
Yeah.
Which is great because it meant that so like half of each episode is in the 30s, and so all we're doing is getting time with people, understanding where they come from and their motivations, and their character dynamics. So we know that Walt and George have this push-pull relationship where they're clearly part of each other's circles and they're important to each other, but they're kind of important to each other because they're both connected to Sheldon. Because they don't their connection is erratic, to say the least, and that's like the big thing that lets them get to, I guess, Europa, some moon of Jupiter, where the powers are gotten, because you see Jupiter up in the sky, and that's cool, right? Like that you get that, but again, it's not quite enough. And they get over it by just staring at each other because Sheldon said we got to work together. We got
to put our differences aside. And they're like, "All right, done."
Yeah. And there's like, "Oh, you too." Is like, "Oh, I didn't think I'd have to put away my differences. Thanks for telling me." Like, so this is, I guess, the thing is like, there's a lot of interesting things being dug up, but I feel like everything is done a little too quickly and a little too shallow, which is why then I'm like, am I reading this really cool social commentary about the mindset of someone who is the custodian of the world right now, or am I reading a character study that's interesting, but with the background of this is a fine viewpoint to have.
Mm-hmm.
He's just a little too far into it, but you're two very. The rest of the show unfolds differently if you're in the former versus the latter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so because we don't have that grounding, we don't really have that character development. Even Sheldon is kind of a little two-dimensional. He has almost all the screen time, but most of it is like, I'm a crazy person seeing my dad. My struggle is, how do I tell people I'm seeing my dad? Like, I'm having these visions, but I'm not. His character isn't really progressing that far in the 30s. Like, he didn't really come to terms with the fact that he was misled by his dad and his dad wasn't a good person,
Oh,
and that he needed to understand what real justice was, which is what I
absolutely.
thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And that was vacant too. It's like, how is he having all this screen time but no development?
Yes, and there's this idea about like there's no kind of like trauma that was ever delved into. Like there's trauma there, you know there is. You can see it. His dad jumps off of a roof right in front of him. There's loads of trauma there, and obviously it's explored a little bit between the conversations that they have as well. You know, and Walter's got some from being the older brother, but always in his younger brother's shadow. They do bring this up, but again, it's very, very shallow, and we don't see kind of any resolution to it. It's almost like you go through this kind of very shallow character development, thinking that it's going to evolve a little bit, but actually it just runs through that timeline. They get the powers, and then it's like, okay, well now we just miss out on the next 80 years, and it's the present from, you know, as it sort of plays through. And again, they do some time shifting things in the present as well with a couple of the characters. So you see his daughter Chloe getting hit by a truck like a couple of episodes before her character is at that point in her story, and then it kind of converges back in, sort of thing. So they're playing around with these kinds of ideas of character development, relationships between them, and how all of that can kind of come together. But as you said, it is very shallow, and we don't get that resolution to their trauma. Like, is it just unresolved for 80 years, and now is the point where he is like, maybe I have to question what I've done, but I won't. But maybe I should.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of
no one.
Yeah, what I was getting to with why it feels more like that. It's that former, or the latter rather, way of thinking of like he's struggling with the code, and they are too. But that's because the world has changed.
Yes.
But he's just more stuck in the ways, but than the rest are, rather than it's always been this way, but you've been blind, which is like my preferred reading because that's more human, and it's also an important message because of the greater societal stuff we're going through and have been for a while. But like that's why I say this is because that intervening 80 years, if we read through how people are reacting, there were supervillains, but superheroes never died or were really in trouble of being dead, like attacked for their lives, because they're so shocked now that the supervillains are trying to kill them in the present day. And it's like, well, that's nonsense, right? Like, these are supervillains. They're going to, at some point, even an accidental death might have happened. Like, it seems so preposterous to me to think that this is just an empty 80-year period where, the only way to make sense of why people are suddenly now en masse questioning the code is because something has fundamentally shifted now. Otherwise, they would have questioned it all this time.
Yeah.
And then they also make a point of saying, we're afraid for our lives now. And it's like, okay, well, what's being a superhero before this? Like, your text is telling me.
It's like the villains were were like cartoon villains. All they wanted to do was just like rob a bank. And that way, you know, not actually hurt anybody. They just wanted bags and bags of money. And no one ever got hurt. They just caught them. They busted through the wall, caught the bad guy, and that was it. End of the day, gave them over to the cops. But it's, you know, when you look at sort of like, you know, in those fight scenes with Black Star, how powerful he kind of is as a character. He absolutely throws them around. That at no point previously did he think, I'm gonna fuck shit up.
Yeah.
He was just like, well, you know, my life could be a bit easier if I had a sofa, so I'll just go nick one.
Yeah,
I'm a
and then also
supervillain.
like, yeah. Oh, I wouldn't. I mean, I could beat the living hell out of you so I survived and escaped and won't be trapped in Supermax. But I wouldn't want to hurt you for that much.
Yeah,
Like I wouldn't want to long term
yeah.
hurt you. So I guess I'll go to prison. Like it makes no sense, and I think it's kind of compounded by like his character is pretty jokey in a lot of the scenes too, and it just feels really like, oh, he's not that evil. I don't know. It's just,
Yes, yeah.
and like I wonder if the point of the original comic was to contrast like Golden Age, Silver Age, like ideals with the gritty Frank Miller style, '90s comic, rather than the life in the '50s, like, in the real world and life now. Because like one of the things that happened in like the late '80s and then throughout the '90s was like making the stakes more gritty and gray. And if what this comic was supposed to be doing was contrasting those different notions, then that makes sense, right? Because literally in comic books, the world was that black and white. But a 2021 television show, after all the things that have happened, especially in America in the past 5 years, it's going to be read as the difference that the world has changed, because that's a message that's out there. And so then it becomes tone deaf of not understanding what your work is doing. So like I could kind of see what the comic might have been doing. I don't know, I haven't read it, right? Which makes a little sense, but it makes no sense here because again, we get this like hollow notion of this 80-year period where, and I guess the Iraq War still happened and stuff.
So this
But like,
again with the idea of the code and them not getting kind of involved in politics and things like that. Have governments and they do say about sort of like there's a not an anti-capitalist kind of message in this, but they do talk about corporations a little bit, and obviously they come from established money originally, but it's just odd that there's nothing bad happened in this world. With having these superheroes, has there been no wars? Has it just been the supervillains doing some things and them having to stuff, or has this been going on completely separately to the development of the world, and they've just allowed everything to kind of continue on? I was just looking for when the comic was originally released. 2013. I have as a date. Jupiter's from Wikipedia. Jupiter's Legacy is an American superhero comic book series first published in 2013. Yeah. So again, it's only 8 years ago.
yeah, it's quite recent.
It's quite recent, but there's been lots of strides forwards, at least in the real world, over the last 5 years.
Wow, strides in some direction.
Strides, yeah, well, yes, and lots of things that we suddenly live in an age where we know things more readily. Information is available to a lot more people, and this kind of seems like it just ignores all of that, and it's just it's not like you send up your utopian signal into the sky to call him because something is kind of going on. There seems like this big disconnect between the real world and the people that live in that, and then the superheroes. There's a point where he flies off to stop an asteroid coming in because somehow there's an asteroid now coming towards him. So he flies off, and it's the part where his wife starts to question kind of everything that's going on. But
yeah, so like one of the young supers who had already sort of questioned or held up the code as the proper thing her like young generation,
yes,
right? And they had confided in her. She's like, well, the code that we need. This was like the wide-eyed optimist, like we definitely need the code now, and I don't know why my peers are questioning it. Clearly, we should, like, the world needs us more than ever. And then one dude escaped because they weren't killing him, and then he ends up killing her in a fight. And Lady Liberty,
Grace,
Elizabeth, the mum, like, comes and beats the tar out of him but doesn't kill him, and then she has to say get a corner for the ghost something blade. So I can't remember. But dude guy gets to live, and you can see that she's had that struggle, and she's covered in his blood, but he's not dead. And this is where I'm like, God, this feels like the Batman movies about I don't kill, but also in all the action sequences, people, including a lot of cops who are just doing their jobs, probably die.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is my problem with the code being don't kill. It's such a, I think that's making fun of, or at least I think it's knowingly showing how the line is arbitrary and like it's a life, but like she like has this guy's face blood all over him, like she punched him half dead, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we also have this really interesting note where in the first fight we see Brandon, and he's like, I guess mismanages it and like goes through a building, and then his dad's like, you're paying for this. And then you're like, how do they, which I thought was really cool, but then he goes to Iowa to find George's son with his transport rod, and he just uses his I-beams in the middle of this one road thoroughfare. It just blows it up, and you're like, you could have fucking fixed that, asshole. And it wasn't even like the guy was running and he has no superpowers. You did need to blow it up. You could have just flown and grabbed him. And that's the thing. It's like, and I hope it was meant to be like, the code is dumb. Hey, hey, in the code dumb. Because we can do whatever we want with our powers so long as it isn't killing someone.
Yes.
Or something. Or it's just like spectacle over sense, where it's like, surely Utopia wouldn't be so reckless. I don't know. Anyway, I sort of overtalked what your point there was going to be. I don't know if I did. Cool. Yeah, so I think we could easily spiral right around this. I think it's just like the core mechanic, if you will, like the core thematic thing of this is that tension of the code, and the times have changed, and there's bits and bobs that sort of indicate how different characters feel. And like you said, Lady Liberty changes her mind throughout, it seems, and she and then you get this really interesting thing in the later half of the season where it's like she's outwardly saying, hey, is it right? And then Utopian shuts her down.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And they have this argument. She's like, no, and she stands up to him. She's like, no, we don't get to, what was it? It was, of all the things we've sacrificed, I won't, or whatever. It's like, I won't sacrifice the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we need to be able to talk about this. But it also paints this really weird picture of how up until, again, that 80 years of just like, well, he's, I guess, our leader, so he's been saying this and no one's questioned ever, except George maybe, but we don't really know what's happened with that because the show chose not to flashback to the important time in the past for that parallels this.
Yeah.
And it's just really odd. And this is why, I guess, that scene and a lot of the earlier ones about how this is so much about him really made me feel like, is this commentary or is this like toxic masculine boomer fantasy? Like everything revolves around me. I'm having a crisis of faith because my kid isn't doing the right thing, but how do I there are other things going on, but it almost always, like, every episode loops back to it really just matters what's going on in Utopian's head, and that's super frustrating.
That it plays out as well with him going to see the psychiatrist, who had previously been a supervillain, was in Supermax, and he goes to talk to him. He's like, he says something like, "You're the only person who understands, what's going on." But he, unloads on this guy, and he talks about sort of like, his son and his daughter as well, Chloe, who's not following that sort of like superhero path, and it definitely, we don't see that. We don't get that depth of character for anyone else. It's not kind of, I mean, a little bit with Chloe. I mean, it is Chloe, isn't it? His daughter.
Yeah.
They explore it. I'll try to explore it a little bit. She gets a little bit more kind of screen time.
She gets screen time, but she doesn't get development. Her arc is still, I hate my dad and don't want to be my dad's shadow.
Yes, but we get a little bit more of the sort of like the fallout and the consequence, at least more from her. Even though they set the show up like Brandon is the one that did something, and this is the event that kind of makes everyone question it. Brandon's then just pretty much sidelined for most of the show.
Yeah.
And it's more Chloe that it delves into. But yes, you don't get anywhere near that character development for anyone else apart from Sheldon. And as we said earlier, even in the flashback periods, it is Sheldon who we follow through. With the occasional bit of conflict between, say, George and Walter, or kind of when they're on the boat with Grace sort of talking him down from having the gun and stuff. We get tiny little hints at these other characters and how they impact on each other, but it's nowhere near as developed as I would like it to be. I think, again, as we talk about with a lot of the sort of the things that we cover on this show, we talked about Justice League and how we'd have liked maybe just an extra 40 minutes. If you're gonna make it 4 hours, just make it 4 hours and 40, and just give us that little bit of extra time. Mortal Kombat could have done with being split into a better structured sort of thing, giving us more character development to set everything up in the modern age. And I think this show suffers from it as well. It needed just that little bit more time exploring the other characters to allow us to understand why they are taking this kind of stance. Why have they hit this point in the future? What is the interesting story here? Yes, they're questioning the code.
Yeah.
But is it just is that it?
Yeah, and again, that's why I'm frustrated, because like those scenes with Jack the therapist, the man who's in Supermax prison in a cell designed like a therapy office because it's cinematic. There's a lot of moments where you're like, wait, this doesn't really make sense, except it's pretty. But anyway, like Jack, those scenes are very much like pushing back against, why are we only paying attention to you? He even asks like, so what, I'm a narcissist? And he's like, no, you have a coping mechanism of trying to be the good boy, and this is how you're dealing with it. Like, I thought that was very like interesting, but then that was like an episode, I think it was episode 5, the last time we sort of had a therapist section, but that was also the last time anyone pushed back or he had any real development. In the rest of the season, he's being stubborn and being like, no, you don't get to talk back to me, to his wife, where they're clearly not partners because he's the head of the Justice Squad Union. That's what they're called.
Union.
And you're like, so why? Again, there's no progress from we have the revelation to the character in these therapy sessions, and then he just stops going and no longer talks about it or has any visible change in what he's doing. He's still reprimanding his son all the time, holding him up to a higher standard, telling everyone the code matters more, getting mad at people who question it, including all of America. Like, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so you've just, as like author, you've told me you're aware that this is a bad state, and then you're like, like it's just a weird dynamic, and I wonder how much of that is, like you said, like the space of the TV show.
Yeah.
But it sucks because then you've got one character who's getting development, but no arc.
And you'd think with the TV show you'd have a little bit more time to explore as well, wouldn't you? I don't know. Again, not knowing the comics, I don't know whether season 1 follows, say, volume 1 or a trade book. Or what episodes it kind of goes through. But you'd think, what were they? How long were the episodes? And there's about 10 of them, I think, maybe 8. Yeah,
that's the thing. Eight's, if it was 10, but maybe it's just not the point. Like, if the point isn't developing all these characters, because it's not in the end, if it's not an ensemble piece, then I think it's missed the mark, because it's moving towards that development. Like Chloe's a great example, as you said. She has baggage about her parents, and she's like kind of working through it with like her relationship with Power Rod's Georgia's son. God, the names are really hard to track, because some of these people are just known as like kid of person.
Yes.
but yeah, like the son of the greatest supervillain and the daughter of the greatest hero. Like they even say that line, and it's like they're developing a thing, and clearly part of it is they're bonding because they are this first generation of born to this group of crazy people, right?
Hutch is his name.
Hutch, yeah. But not a lot comes out of it, and it still feels like she's being hedonistic. She's just found someone who kind of understands that. So there's a hint at like you get why they're just like cocooning in his flat and boning down a bunch with each other because they have a shared history and like in that way. And then it's like, well, maybe more will happen in season 2.
Yeah, yeah, and there's lots of stuff that's kind of unexplored, right? I there was a moment when it flashed back and they had their powers and they all came into a room to sort of sit around a table, and one of the guy they found who was at sea,
Richard or something,
I think, has that rod that Hutch then has, but then I'm pretty sure we're told that it was George's rod, and he gave it to, or Hutch inherited it from him. So at some point there is a transfer of that item, right? Again, an important part, an important understanding of how he got that, or why George has that. It doesn't explore those extra kind of bits, even as a as just an off comment or something, just to give us a little bit. And I wonder again if we then have a similar structure for season 2, that it does tell this modern story but does flash back again, and that starts to fill out more of the details about why George becomes a villain, and how that dynamic has changed. But it's something we just needed more of in season 1. For me to watch season 2, I just needed a bit more of that, without me going, hopefully we'll get to that at some point.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's this like predicted sequel holding back for predicted sequel is just not great. You need to stand on your own 2 feet. And yeah, so like I like some intrigue. Like I like the idea that like Blue Bolt or Richard is a character we meet briefly in the flashbacks. He's clearly an original Union member, but then there's a gap and we don't know what happened. All we know is he had the power rod and now Hutch has it, and George, who left the Union on bad terms to say the least, is that was the one who gave it to him. And you're like, oh, there's a lot of questions here, and I don't mind that if we had other things going on, right? But like George's character is only in the past, really, and most of it is you're a spoiled, womanizing rich kid who lost his parents.
Yes, yeah.
Is very exceedingly rich, and then isn't anymore in a flash. But also, kind of is like, I guess one of the problems is like they put a lot of work into making these people rich, and then the stock market ruining things. But then also, not really. The board made us sell the plants for pennies on the dollars, but also you still have a Rolls Royce you're driving to a worker's neighborhood. And you can afford to pay 6-month wages up front, and you can charter a boat, and it's like, okay, you are functionally rich in this show. So I get there's degrees of richness, but it feels really weird.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, so yeah, it's just a little too clunky, I think, for how far we've come. Especially like we have things like, I haven't seen Invincible yet, but I've heard really good things about its gray area stuff.
Yeah,
The Boys obviously comes to mind as far as gray area superheroes. Like this doesn't quite cut the mustard in the modern landscape, I think, is the problem.
I agree, and I think The Boys is a great kind of example to bring up, because The Boys isn't just an ensemble piece; it's 2 ensemble shows. You've got the guys without any powers, and it delves into their characters and does so very well. And then you've got the superheroes, the people with powers, and it delves into that side of things very well, and the very fraught and insane relationships that they have around that. And yes, there is a little bit of saying, well, actually, The Boys is a lot of Homelander, but it's a lot of Huey and Butcher as well. And it doesn't really make you focus too much on one character. It kind of puts them on a pedestal to sort of say that, yes, this is the most powerful character, and a lot of the interesting and important points that happen in the story do involve that character, but there's so much more going on with a lot of the other characters in The Boys. And I really like The Boys. I think it did that very, very well and explored all of those characters very well, whilst being a much more action-packed kind of show. You know, there was a lot going on, and maybe the episodes were a bit longer, gave us a little bit, and the series was maybe a little bit longer as well, so it had a bit more screen time to sort of play with than Jupiter's Legacy has elected to give itself. You know, there's no reason why, apart from maybe budgetary constraints, that they went, let's make it 8 episodes rather than 12, and we could have had an extra hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever, however long the episodes are, of getting into character development and things like that. And I think currently, if you know, I have absolutely no question that if someone turned around and said, well, you know, you can pay for Netflix and you can watch season 2 of Jupiter's Legacy, or you can only pay for Amazon, whatever Amazon thing is, Prime
Video,
and only watch The Boys, I would give Amazon my money. I don't want to give Amazon my money, but I'd give Amazon my money. It just, The Boys does so much more, and I think it's a similar kind of show, really, to try and show, and it wants to show those grey areas. It wants to show those relationships between people. It just does it much more successfully than Jupiter's Legacy does.
But that's because it's doing a thing about relationships between people, not one man having the world on his shoulders because he refuses to let it not be the case. Which is again an interesting thing. Like, I'm not trying to say, oh, I don't like that it's a rich white dude from the 30s and he's got all the power, and when things don't go his way, that sucks, and I just don't care about that story because it's boring. I'm saying, if you're being that story, you have to be that story, and it feels like a lot of the markers of this thing is ensemble, or at least using him as a focal point for a bigger conversation, but he's too much he's like, the focus is entirely on him, such that most characters come off as ripples of Sheldon. His wife pushing back at him is like the first time she has any sort of agency, and it's really just to make him feel like he's losing his grip on things. Not that his wife, this fully fledged character, is like, we gotta talk. Like, that's what it feels like, because basically she was like she's a neutered Lois Lane character. She starts with like being an antagonist to him, but really just a foil for him understanding that his dad wasn't good, and then immediately stops being this brassy person. The rest of the 30s, she's kind of in the background, except for doing some like poking around, and then she's like, Sheldon, things are weird. Like all of that, like, pushiness. Even when she finds the drawings and she gets caught, and he's like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "What is this? I'm gonna try and hide it." That's like a demure deference character. When really it's like, we're on a boat in the middle of fucking nowhere, and you're drawing crazy pictures of your dad. I'm the brash bassy reporter who survived that bullpen, such that even when I lost my job, I was yelling at people and pouring out coffee because it's my fucking cup. And that's the person I want to see. And she's already lost all of those traits in the 30s, but by the time we fast forward 80 years, she's just like a listen to your father, like flat, generic, wifey character. And it's like, why? It's, again, giving me this interesting introduction to her, and then having not even in like the weeks following keeping it up, just makes me disappointed. If she was just a demure character we never saw her past, I would actually honestly like it better. But they're giving us this hints of a development, like, of more dimensions, and then not doing it. And yeah, it's just really frustrating that way. Which makes me like, I think, having been binged it as well, I think it would have been much better if I watched this like once a week, because I wouldn't be noticing like episode on episode. It's like, oh yes, here are exactly all the ways these people only matter because of Sheldon. Right, because once you pick up on it, if you're just like, oh, that sucked, that
just
whole
follows
episode was
through
so Sheldon
constantly.
oriented.
Yeah.
You go your next episode and you're like, okay, so how is this Sheldon oriented? Which I get is like a little confirmation biasy, which I think it was kind of confirmed in ways, but I think it would have been easier to see some of the other things working, even if they were a bit clunky, instead of being like, nah.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Okay.
like Brainwave, like the big heel turn, which you can get immediately in episode 1. That something's like Walt's introduction is, oh yeah, it's the older brother with the beard, and he's kind of like likes his wine, and he's a bad guy. And I think they did a good job of waiting long enough for the heel turn that I was like,
Yes.
oh yeah,
Absolutely.
I forgot he was going to be the bad guy. Like I had a moment, like when it happened, I was like, oh right, that was definitely going to happen at one point. Like I like, at no point did it totally dissuade me of it. I just kind of forgot that that was the read I had, and then as soon as it started, like seconds before it was, was about to happen, like right, cool, I get what you're doing again. But I think that's good, right? That's kind of playing with the tropes. But why? Do you know why Walt heel turned?
I can't remember.
Hmm.
I can't remember.
But things have stagnated under Sheldon, and we need to change control.
Is that it? Was that really it?
That's what his speech was, kinda. But also, what I did like was there were hints at him being involved with the George incident of previous decades.
Mm-hmm.
And then, again, it's like, interesting. So is this like the long con? But also, why would you wait an extra 20 years?
So again, where is that development?
And why do I have to wait till? Why? I have a certain number of years on the planet, and it's less than the Utopian because I don't have superpowers. I'm gonna waste my fucking time on the potential of this being good in season 2. Like, build intrigue, but don't withhold.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
that heel turn is unjustified in what we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what the character had to do, and I feel like a lot of the moves in this thing is like plot directs this to happen, rather than I get the feeling of this person would do this. Like, it feels very much last couple seasons of Game of Thrones rather than first couple seasons. Right? Character driven drama that takes you in weird ways versus plot driven drama that needs to take the characters that way. And I feel like so much of TV has been trying to be the former. And this presents itself like it's doing that, because like a lot of characters get a lot of screen time over the 8 episodes, but again, like we were saying, they don't move that far in that screen time. So I think we kind of danced around but basically, if everyone's cardboard, definitely the people of color and the women are cardboard. I think I need to bring it up just because, like, not only is the wife of Foyle and Chloe is in his shadow, she's every other female character who's not in that like nuclear family is cardboard.
Yes.
And like the one, and it's a lot of it is just reflecting the previous, like almost all the kids. To be fair, it's also almost all the kids are just reflections of their parents.
Of their parents. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So it might not just be, you know, patriarchal. It might just be, this is why I think this is what makes me feel like it's boomer fantasy, if that makes sense.
I think it's something to do with a lot of the time the kids inherit the power, don't they? It's not that they inherit being a super powered person, they actually inherit the power of their parent. So they are kind of, you know, I know Brandon goes by Paragon, but he is like Utopian too, isn't he?
Yeah, he doesn't quite have. Yeah, they even make a line of like, I can't shoot eye beams under my head, and he's like, yet. His dad says, yeah, right?
Yes, yeah, and I didn't realize, but Fitz, who is the Flare, because of the bright energy, the guy who is for all of the modern part in a wheelchair. And is the sciencey guy, the science guy.
Yeah.
Because it told us in the 30s he likes to read, so of course he's the science guy.
Yeah, the guy who likes to read in the 30s as a black man who works in a mill has access to so many historical books that he can on site be like Maori, Viking, detergent in an engine. I'm like, yeah, well, you know what? It's a trope. I'll let it go because at least it could be way worse as a character. So I'd rather him be like a a Mary Sue type intelligent character than not, I guess. Like there's worse things that can happen, but it does feel kind of silly.
Yeah, well, so Petra, his daughter,
Mm.
who's the one who comes to Brandon actually and says that she's been, questioning these kinds of things, which gives Brandon that kind of little bit of a turn to think, actually, no, I will kind of extol the virtues of the code that we have been given from my father to you, and maybe that's it changing my mind. Maybe. But she's just called Flair 2.
Like TOO?
No. No. Flair II.
Yeah, I know. It could also be Flair as well.
Yeah.
I'm the Flair too.
No. The Flair 2. So again, just I suppose hammering in that these kids, that next generation, do inherit the powers of their parents, and who knows how long these people will kind of live, but it's just passing on. But there's a lot of next generation people, right? For the 5 of them just getting powers on the island.
Yeah, so this is what I.
There's a lot of next generation kids with.
So I think this is where the world building kind of falls apart, because also where do the supervillains come from with their powers?
So that's I questioned this during it, and whether when they were on the island and it blasts out and all of the guys on the boat are hit, whether that maybe they don't get powers, but then their children have power. Children they have after they've been hit by that shockwave then get powers. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. I don't know whether it was explored or mentioned at all.
I think it's supposed to be mysterious. Like I feel like they realized, hey, if we do this parallel structure, we need it to last through more than one season. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So we can't do much. Like they overcorrected for the idea of the worry of what will we do when we run out of the 30s timeline. How do we continue if this is the structure of our show? And rather than being like, we'll move to the 50s and just slowly there's enough, 80 years is enough time where you can be like 1 year of the real world is like a decade coverage or whatever. Like you can just move to a different part and make up new things or whatever. I feel like they just overcorrected and so just are holding so much back so that they can still spoon it out. Spool it out, I mean. But yeah, I mean it's tough. It's close to what I was hoping it would be, I guess is the thing. It's just the ways it's not are specifically the things I don't like about this type of commentary, I guess, right? It's too stapled into one specific perspective while acknowledging other perspectives exist. When it's like, okay, if this was mindless, I could forgive it and more easily watch it as, okay, I'm not thinking about its social commentary because it's biased or whatever. And this is I really want to play in this sphere, but I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm not spending the time to do it. I think that's where my frustration really, really boils down to.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to, in the last few minutes, is I have a genuine point of confusion on what happened in the end. So we find out that the clone of Black Star was secretly made by Brainwave, Walter, and he planted things to make it look like George did it. Right? And then we're like, and then he shows, and so before we find that out, he's going into Black Star's clone's mind with the help of his daughter, and he is struggling and almost dying, and then he finds a pocket of time or something, this weird little dimensional space where George is, and they fight, but then Lady Liberty comes and rescues him, and that's why he doesn't die to George. And then they escape, and then he shows her George's message, which is George smoking a cigarette over Paragon and Utopian being dead, and she's like, oh no, George wants to kill my family. And you're like, but then after that you find out, oh, he's secretly behind all this. So then I get him showing Lady Liberty that vision, be like, well, I got a message from George, because secretly I'm the one behind this, and I'm trying to drive Utopian and Paragon apart, and part of that is like, hey, they're in trouble or something, sharing this vision, right? That makes it seem like George is behind all this. I get that. But every other part of that plan makes no sense to me. So you're going into a dangerous situation where you might die in this clone's brain to find out a thing you know. I get keeping up appearances. Maybe he could always leave, but then I don't actually understand. Was it that he made up a fake George and situation? Because one of the things that sucks is like in all the visions, he's like he makes a point of being like, in this area I'm God because it's the psychic realm. He said that before. He's like maneuvers all these people, and then fighting George, it's like I'm being punched and etc. And it looks very performative. It doesn't match. Like he doesn't need to fucking punch anyone in that
Yeah,
realm.
yeah,
Like
sure.
that's the whole point. So then I think, oh, he's putting on an act. Once we find out he's the heel, right? But then the act is for Lady Liberty, but he had no. There's no guarantee that she comes in to catch him in this space.
So I think, I think part of that because his daughter, who they bring in because they
is watching, maybe
is watching. So I wonder whether part of that is performative to try and stop her from figuring it out, even though she does figure it out.
And then it kills her because it has to be extreme.
But yeah, there's comments mentioned that she's more powerful than he is within that realm. So whether he tried to make it a bit more performative for her part to stop her from figuring it out, but then she was powerful enough to figure it out or to see through kind of the ruse. Again, another thing that is kind of unexplained and almost just feels like it's thrown in because there weren't any other action scenes going on for a little while, so throw something in that they needed to give George, or not George, but they needed to give Skyfox a little bit of screen time, and maybe this was the best way they could think of.
So I guess like it makes sense when you watch it forwards, right? Because at the time that fight scene happens, you don't know about the heel turn. And so it's like, yes. And then you see Lady Liberty witnessing it. And then if you just think, oh, right, this was all like he's trying to put on a ruse to trick people into thinking George did it. That's sort of the thing that his daughter explains, right? We get that exposition via her confronting him and asking for $50 million, right? And so that all makes sense and you can recognize it. But again, it's like when you think back about there was no guarantee Lady Liberty would come in. So then who is this struggle for? That's why I feel it feels, again, like you said, if there was a little more explanation almost, like there's something missing that makes it feel like it's loose writing rather than clever scheming. Because the clever scheming doesn't, like, it's like, oh, it was a clever scheme. Thanks, screenplay. And then you think back about it and like, well, that clever scheme is so tangential on success.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, this feels like loose writing that you just like wrote the scene and just said, look, he was doing it for Lady Liberty, but then he couldn't have known. And like that's the type of thing that when this type of thing is happening throughout the show, these sort of shortcuts, like a good example that really when I was thinking about, when is like they were surprised they had visitors, the Flair and his dad. They're like, they walk in and suddenly they see Sheldon and George in the kitchen and they're shocked. They're like, what are you doing here? Oh my God. They had just come home. And then they kick them out of the house later and you see them leave the house and there's a fucking Rolls Royce parked in front of the house.
Yes.
And you're like, they're as if they didn't see a Rolls Royce when they came in and said like, someone with a Rolls Royce, it looks like my old boss's car. But even if I didn't know it was my old boss, it's like, some rich dude is in our neighborhood parked in front of my house. And then they open the door and they'd be like, what are you doing here? Like that's what I mean about like it doesn't make sense. And when you notice that in a couple other places, then this really big pivotal thing, I'm going to default to, I don't think you've thought this through. I think this is loose writing because I've seen it in other places versus, like you said, an interpretation I hadn't considered was it was performative for the daughter, but because it's just too patchy, it just comes off as that you probably won't notice that this doesn't line up.
Yeah, completely.
Anyway, any last thoughts?
No, I think we've delved into a reasonable amount of the shows. Lots of characters we kind of haven't talked about, but talked around the idea that they didn't really have much to do or weren't developed very well. So I think it needs a lot of work. I think for season 2, for me to say this is something I would continue with, I'd give season 2, at least the first episode, the benefit of the doubt. And be interested in seeing, Walter and how that kind of plays out within that first episode. But that first episode really needs to capture me for me to put any more time into the rest of the season and any forthcoming season after that as well. I believe it's quite a long-running comic. I think it's still going, right?
I don't know. I didn't look into it. I wanted to kind of see it pretty fresh. I think I'm a little harsher than you. I think there's enough stuff that I'd be okay with this being like, I get a notion of Jupiter's Legacy and sit on it. My line would be hearing from people. So like, you watch the first episode and you're like, this is good. I'm gonna watch episode 2. That'll make me watch episode 1. Like hearing.
Yes. Yeah.
Good,
okay.
Like
yeah.
I'm not going to give it the benefit of the doubt. I'm gonna wait for people to say, this is worth it. Like, so I'm a little more, I think, I'm a little more less enthused. That makes sense, but sounds really weird. Yeah, I'm a little more hesitant to just keep this up.
Yeah.
Just because it just didn't hit me the right way, and that, like, I'm not a stickler for bad writing, but when the thematic stuff is like waffling between either something I might enjoy or something that I think is a letdown, and then the rest is kind of meh, I'm not gonna like get out of bed for something else along the same lines until I hear that they've maybe patched those things or made it clear that the balance is in the way that I was hoping rather than fearing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that does us for the week. So thanks for tuning in, folks. As always, you can find this and other things at outoflives.net with VODs, other podcasts, articles, videos, etc., reviews, lots of games, pop culture stuff. You can, if you have comments on Jupiter's Legacy, please reach out. You can email us at podcast@outoflives.net, at outoflivesnet on Twitter, Ben at Nova_47, me, Adil at the Omniarch. Yeah, that's basically it. Like, follow, subscribe, share with friends. But yeah, please get in touch. Tell us why you think we missed some things on Jupiter's Legacy, or why we were too easy on it, as the case may be. Yeah, that's just us for another week. I've been Adil.
I've been Ben.
Bye.
See ya. Thanks.
www.outoflives.net